In a forgotten corner of the universe, where the lines between reality and dreams blur and possibilities swirl in a mist of wonder, lies the vast landscape of your mind. Unlocking the full potential of your mind is your master key to uncovering the hidden secrets of a realm that few dare to explore. Imagine a place where your thoughts are seeds that can grow into mighty trees of creativity, success, and happiness. What if I told you that limitless potential resides within you, just waiting to be awakened? Join William W. Atkinson, a pioneer in positive thinking and personal development, on an enthralling journey through the intricate and often mysterious paths of your mind. Each chapter of this text serves as a doorway to fresh perspectives, practical techniques and profound insights that will empower you to reprogram your thoughts and broaden your horizons. You'll learn how to turn doubts into confidence, fears into courage, and dreams into tangible realities. With curiosity as your compass, you will embark on a transformative journey of self-discovery, where the tools of conscious thought become your greatest allies. As you navigate this exploration, you'll realize that the power of your mind is not just an abstract idea, but a tangible force capable of reshaping your life in ways you never thought possible. Prepare to unlock the hidden potential within you and challenge the limitations life has placed upon you. The adventure is about to unfold, and everything you need is already inside you. Welcome to the captivating world of your mind. What is the mind? Psychology is generally considered the science of the mind, although it is more precisely the science of mental states, thoughts, feelings, and acts of will. In the past, writers addressing psychology used to start by attempting to define and describe the nature of the mind before examining the various mental states and activities. However, recent authorities have rebelled against this requirement, arguing that it is no more reasonable to expect psychology to explain the ultimate nature of the mind than it is to expect physical science to explain the ultimate nature of matter. Any attempt to explain the ultimate nature of either is futile. There is no real need for such an explanation in either case. Physics can explain the phenomena of matter, and psychology can explain those of the mind, without concerning itself with the ultimate nature of the substance in either realm. Physical science has made steady progress over the last century, despite revolutions in theories about the ultimate nature of matter. The facts about the phenomena of matter remain, even though theories about its nature change. Science demands and holds on to facts, considering theories to be mere working hypotheses at best. Someone once said that theories are just bubbles with which the older children of science amuse themselves. Science holds several well-founded yet opposing theories about the nature of electricity, but the facts concerning electrical phenomena and their application are accepted by all the disagreeing theorists. The same is true in psychology. The facts about mental states are widely agreed upon, and methods for developing mental faculties are used effectively, regardless of whether one believes the mind is a product of the brain or that the brain is merely an organ of the mind. And the fact that the brain and nervous system are involved in thought phenomena is accepted by all, and that is all that is needed to establish the science of psychology. Debates over the ultimate nature of the mind are now generally left to philosophers and metaphysicians, while psychology devotes all its attention to studying the laws of mental activities and discovering methods of mental development. Even philosophy is growing weary of the eternal why and is focusing more and more on the how. The pragmatic spirit has invaded the field of philosophy, as expressed by the words of Professor William James, who said, "Pragmatism is the attitude of looking away from first things, principles, categories, supposed necessities, and of looking towards last things, fruits, consequences, facts." Modern psychology is essentially pragmatic in its approach to the subject of the mind, leaving the old arguments and disputes about the ultimate nature of the mind to metaphysics. It devotes all its energies to discovering the laws of mental activities and states, and to developing methods for the mind to achieve more, perform better, conserve its energies, and focus its strengths. For modern psychology, the mind is something to use, not just a subject for speculation and theorizing. While metaphysicians lament this trend, pragmatic people in the world welcome it. Defining the mind is defined as the faculty or power by which thinking creatures feel, think, and will. This definition is inadequate and circular by nature, but that is inevitable, for the mind can only be defined in terms of its own processes. Apart from its own activities, The mind cannot be defined or conceived. It knows itself only through its activities. The mind without mental states is a mere abstraction, a word without a corresponding image or mental concept. Sir William Hamilton expressed the matter as clearly as possible when he said, "What we mean by mind is simply that which perceives, thinks, feels, wills, and desires. Without perception, thought, feeling, will, and desire, it is impossible to form a clear conception or mental image of the mind. Deprived of its phenomena, it becomes a mere abstraction." Think about what is thinking. Perhaps the simplest way to convey the idea of the existence and nature of the mind is the one attributed to a famous German psychology professor who used to begin his course by asking his students to think about something, for example, his desk. Then he would say, "Now think about what is thinking about the desk." After a pause, he would add, "That thing that thinks about the desk, and which you are thinking about right now, is the subject of our study in psychology." The professor could not have said more if he had lectured for a month. Professor Gordy spoke very well on this subject. The mind must be what thinks, feels, and wills, or it must be the thoughts, feelings, and acts of will of which we are conscious. Mental facts, in a word. But what do we know about what thinks, feels, and wills, and what can we discover about it? Where is it? You will probably say that it is in the brain. But if you are speaking literally, if you say it is in the brain like a pencil is in a pocket, then you must mean that it occupies a location, that it takes up space, and that would make it very much like a material thing. In reality, the more you think about it, the clearer you will see what thinkers have long known. We know nothing and can learn nothing about this thing that thinks, feels, and wills. It is beyond the reach of human knowledge. The books that define psychology as the science of the mind say nothing about what thinks, feels, and wills. They deal entirely with those thoughts, feelings, and acts of will, that is, with mental facts, attempting to tell us what they are, classifying them, and telling us the circumstances or conditions in which they exist. It seems to me that it would be better to define psychology as the science of the experiences, phenomena, or facts of the mind, soul, or self, in a word, mental facts. Given the facts, and following the example of the best modern authorities in this book, we will leave the question of the ultimate nature of the mind to the metaphysicians and limit ourselves to mental facts, the laws governing them, and the best methods to acquire and use them in the affairs of life. The classification and method of development followed in this book are as follows. The mechanism of mental states, that is, the brain, nervous system, sensory organs, etc. The fact of consciousness and its levels. The mental processes or faculties, that is, sensation and perception, representation or imagination and memory, feeling or emotion, intellect or reasoning and understanding, will or volition. Mental states depend on the physical mechanism to manifest themselves, whatever the ultimate nature of the mind may be. Mental states, whatever their specific character, belong to one of the 5 general categories of mental activities mentioned. The mechanism of mental states, the mental machinery through which we feel, think, and will, consists of the brain, nervous system, and sensory organs. Whatever the true nature of the mind, and whatever theory is held regarding its activities, it must be admitted that the mind depends on this mechanism to manifest what we call mental states. As marvelous as the nature of the mind may be, it seems to depend on this physical mechanism to express its activities, and this dependence involves not only the brain, but the entire nervous system. The best authorities agree that the highest and most complex mental states are merely an evolution of simple sensation, and that they rely on sensation for their raw material in terms of feeling and thought. It is therefore appropriate to begin with a study of the machinery of sensation, which requires an initial consideration of the nerves. The nerves. The body is traversed by a complex system of nerves, often compared to a vast telegraph system. The nerves transmit sensations from various parts of the body to the great receiving center, the brain. They also serve to transmit motor impulses from the brain to various parts of the body, impulses that cause movement in the appropriate parts. There are also other nerves, which are not dealt with in this book, but which perform certain physiological functions such as digestion, secretion, excretion, and circulation. Our main concern here is with the sensory nerves. Sensory nerves transmit impressions from the outside world to the brain. The brain is the central station of the sensory nerves, which have thousands of sending stations throughout the body, with nerve endings in the skin. When these nerve endings are irritated or excited, they send messages to the brain demanding attention. This is true not only for the nerves of touch or sensation, but also for those connected to the respective senses of sight, smell, taste, and hearing. In fact, the best authorities claim that the five senses are merely an evolution of the primary sense of touch or sensation. The sense of touch. The nerves of touch end in the outer layer of the body, that is, the skin. They inform us of contact with other physical objects. Through this information, we are not only aware of the contact with the external object, but also many facts about the nature of that object, such as its degree of hardness, roughness, etc., as well as its temperature. Some nerve endings are very sensitive, like those at the tip of the tongue and fingers, while others are relatively less sensitive, like those in the back. Some of these sensory nerves are limited to reporting contact and degrees of pressure, while others specialize in transmitting the degrees of temperature of the objects with which their endings are in contact. Some respond to high temperatures, while others only respond to low temperatures. The nerves in certain parts of the body, such as those in the cheeks, are particularly sensitive to impressions of warmth. The sense of sight. The nerves of sight terminate in the complex optical apparatus commonly known as the eye. What is called the retina is a highly sensitive nerve membrane that lines the inside and back of the eye where the fibers of the optic nerve end. The optical instrument of the eye transmits focused light vibrations to the nerves of the retina, from which the impulse is sent to the brain. But contrary to popular belief, the eye nerves do not measure distances or make inferences. That is clearly the mind's role. The simple task of the optic nerves is to transmit information about the color and degrees of intensity of light waves. The sense of hearing. The nerves of the sense of hearing end in the inner part of the ear. The eardrum receives the sound vibrations entering the ear cavities, amplifies and adjusts them, then transmits them to the endings of the auditory nerve in the inner ear, which relays the sensation to the brain. The auditory nerve informs the brain about the degrees of pitch, intensity, quality, and harmony of the sound waves received by the eardrum. It is well known that certain sound vibrations are too low to be perceived by the auditory nerve, while others are too high to be detected, although both types can be recorded by scientific instruments. It is also considered that some lower animals are aware of sound vibrations that human auditory nerves cannot register. The sense of smell. The nerves of the sense of smell terminate in the mucous membrane of the nasal cavities. For these nerves to transmit the smell of external objects, tiny particles of the object in question must come into contact with the mucous membrane of the nasal cavities. This is only possible when air containing these particles passes through the nasal passages. Mere proximity to the nostril is not enough. These particles are mostly composed of subtle gases. Some substances affect the olfactory nerves much more strongly than others, depending on their chemical composition. The olfactory nerves then transmit this information to the brain. The sense of taste. The nerves of taste end in the tongue, or more precisely in the tiny cells of the tongue called taste buds. Substances introduced into the mouth chemically affect these small cells, causing an impulse that is transmitted to the taste nerves, which then inform the brain of the sensation. Authorities state that taste sensations can be reduced to 5 main categories: sweet, bitter, sour, salty, and spicy. There are certain nerve centers that play an important role in the production and expression of mental states, located in the skull and spine, the brain and spinal cord, which we will examine in the next chapter. The major nerve centers. The major nerve centers that play an important role in the production and expression of mental states are the brain and spinal cord. The spinal cord is a cord or strand of nerve substance encased within the spinal column or backbone. It exits from the lower part of the skull and extends downward inside the spine for about 18 inches. However, it is continuous with the brain, and it is difficult to determine where one ends and the other begins. It consists of a mass of gray matter, surrounded by a layer of white matter. From the spinal cord, along its length, emerge 31 pairs of spinal nerves that branch out on either side of the body and connect to various minor nerves extending throughout the system. The spinal cord is the great central cable of the nervous telegraph system, and any injury or obstruction to it paralyzes or disables the parts of the body whose nerves enter the spinal cord below the point of injury or obstruction. Such injuries or obstructions not only inhibit sensory reports from the affected area, but also prevent the motor impulses from the brain that are intended to move the limbs or body parts. The ganglia, or little brains, what are called ganglia, or small groups of nerve cells, are found in various parts of the nervous system, including the spinal nerves. These groups of nerve cells are sometimes referred to as little brains and play a very important role in the mechanism of thought and action. The spinal ganglia receive sensory information and send out motor impulses, often without involving the central brain. These activities are known as reflex nerve action. Reflex action, and what is called reflex nerve action, is one of the most remarkable activities of the nervous and mental mechanism, and knowledge of it often surprises the average person who generally believes that such activities are only possible for the central brain. It has been proven that not only is the central brain actually a trinity composed of three brains, but in addition, each of them has a large number of little brains spread throughout the nervous system, all capable of receiving sensory information and sending motor impulses. It is useful to know this marvelous form of neuromental activity. For example, when ash enters the eye, information is sent to a ganglion, which issues a motor impulse and the eyelid closes. The same result occurs when an object approaches the eye without entering it. In both cases, the person is unaware of the sensation or the motor impulse until the act has taken place. This is a reflex act. The instinctive movement of the foot when tickled is another example, as is the withdrawal of the hand burned by a cigarette or pricked by a pin. Involuntary activities and those known as unconscious activities result from reflex acts. Acquired reflexes and motor habits. It is also true that many activities, initially voluntary, become what are called acquired reflexes or motor habits. This happens through certain nerve centers that develop the habit of sending certain motor impulses in response to certain sensory information. Many familiar movements in daily life, such as walking, using a knife and fork, typing, etc., are performed in this way. The movement of a decapitated snake, the muscle contractions of a headless frog, or the violent movements of decapitated birds are examples of reflex action. Medical reports indicate that in cases of decapitation, even a man may display similar reflex action in certain cases. This shows that we can feel and act through our little brains, as well as through the central brain. The three brains, what is called the human brain, is actually a trinity of three brains, respectively known as 1. The medulla oblongata, 2. The cerebellum, and 3. The cerebrum. If we want to limit mental activity to conscious intellectual effort, then only in this case is one right to consider the brain, or large brain, as the only brain. The medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is an extension of the spinal cord at the base of the brain. Its function is to control the involuntary activities of the body, such as breathing, circulation, assimilation, etc. It can be said, in a broad sense, that its activities are a highly developed and complex form of reflex activities. They manifest primarily through the sympathetic nervous system, which controls vital functions without needing to engage the large brain, and are capable of being performed without the involvement of ordinary consciousness. The cerebellum. The cerebellum, also known as the little brain, is located just above the medulla oblongata and just below the posterior part of the brain, or large brain. It combines the nature of a purely reflex center on one hand and that of the memory of habits on the other. In short, it lies between the activities of the brain and the medulla oblongata, sharing certain characteristics of both. It is the organ responsible for many acquired reflexes, such as walking and many other familiar muscle movements, which were first learned consciously but have become habitual. The skater, cyclist, typist, or machine operator depends on the cerebellum for the ease and speed with which they perform their movements without having to think about them. One could say that a set of muscle movements, like those mentioned, is never fully mastered until the cerebellum has taken over the task and relieved the brain of the conscious effort. A technique is never perfectly acquired until the cerebellum assumes control of the necessary movements, sending impulses outside the conscious plane. The brain. The brain, also called the large brain, is considered the brain by the general public. It is located in the upper part of the skull and occupies most of the cranial cavity. It is divided into two major sections or hemispheres. Modern authorities agree that the brain has specialized areas or regions for different functions. Some receive sensory information from the nerves and sensory organs, while others send motor impulses responsible for voluntary physical actions. Many of these areas or regions have been identified by science, while others remain to be discovered. It is very likely that in time, science will correctly locate the area or region for each type of sensation and impulse. The cortex, the area for thought, memory, and imagination, has not been clearly located, although it is believed that these mental states reside in the thin outer layer of grey matter that surrounds and covers the brain mass. Additionally, it is probable that higher reasoning processes take place in or through the cortex of the frontal lobes. The cortex of a person of average intelligence, if spread out on a flat surface, would measure about 4 square feet. The higher the intelligence of an animal or human, the deeper and more numerous the folds or convolutions of the cortex, and the finer its structure. It can be said, as a general rule with very few exceptions, that the higher the degree of intelligence in an animal or human, the larger the surface area of the cortex relative to the size of the brain. It is important to remember that the cortex is folded into deep grooves or convolutions. In shape and divisions, the brain resembles the inside of an English walnut. The interior of the 2 cerebral hemispheres is largely composed of connective nerves, which presumably serve to produce and maintain the functional unity of mental processes. While physiological psychology has done remarkable work in discovering brain centers and explaining much of the mechanism of mental processes, it has only touched upon the most elementary and simple mental processes. The higher processes have so far defied any analysis or explanation in physiological terms. Consciousness. The fact of consciousness is the great mystery of psychology. It is difficult to precisely define this term, although any person of average intelligence understands what is meant by it. Webster defines it as the knowledge of one's own existence, sensations, mental operations, and other aspects, the knowledge or immediate perception of any object, state, or sensation, being aware or sensitive. Another authority defines consciousness as the state of being aware of one's own sensations, the power, faculty, or mental state of being aware of one's existence, condition, thoughts, feelings, and actions at a given time. According to Hayek, consciousness is that indefinable characteristic of mental states that makes us aware of them. It is clear that the idea of awareness is central to consciousness itself. However, it is impossible to precisely define consciousness, as it is so unique and different from everything else that we have no other terms synonymous with it. We can only define it in terms of itself, as shown by the definitions above, and it is equally impossible to clearly explain its emergence or nature. Huxley expressed this difficulty well by saying that the production of consciousness by the irritation of nerve tissue is as inexplicable as the appearance of a genie when Aladdin rubs his lamp. All we can learn about the nature of consciousness, we must learn by turning to our own consciousness and observing its mental operations through introspection. By directing our conscious gaze inward, we can perceive the flow of our thoughts, from their emergence in the subconscious regions of the mind to their disappearance into the same region. It is a common mistake to assume that we have direct awareness of external objects. This is impossible, as there is no direct knowledge of these objects. We are only conscious of our sensations or mental images of external objects. What we can be directly aware of is only our own experiences or mental states. We cannot be directly conscious of anything outside our own mind. For example, when we see a tree, we are not directly aware of the tree itself, but only of the sensation we experience in our nerves, produced by the impact of light waves carrying the image of the tree. Similarly, when we touch a tree, we are directly conscious only of the sensations transmitted by the nerves in our fingers when they come into contact with the tree. The role of the subconscious. It is important to note that consciousness covers only a small part of mental activities. The idea that every mental state or mental fact falls within the field of consciousness is a misconception that was widely accepted for years. Today it is recognized that the field of consciousness is very narrow and limited, and that the vast majority of mental activity takes place outside its bounds. Beyond the narrow field of consciousness lies the vast subconscious reservoir of memory, where past experiences are stored, ready to be brought back to consciousness by an effort of will or by association in an ordinary memory. In this vast region, thought also manifests and performs much of its work. Emotions and feelings, which play a crucial role in our lives, are born here, often as vague disturbances long before reaching the plane of consciousness. In this subconscious region, ideas, feelings, and concepts are formed that eventually emerge at the level of consciousness, manifesting what is called genius. It is also where imagination operates, performing most of its work before presenting its results to consciousness, often to the surprise of the individual. In the subconscious realm, a particular process of mental mastication, digestion, and assimilation occurs, which all intellectual workers are well acquainted with. This process absorbs the raw material given to it, separates, digests, assimilates, and then represents it to the conscious faculties sometime later in a transformed form. It is estimated that at least 85% of our mental activities take place below or outside the field of consciousness. Modern psychology now pays significant attention to this vast area of the mind, once neglected, and the psychology of tomorrow will devote even more focus to it. Leading contemporary authorities agree that within the realm of the subconscious mind lies the explanation for many otherwise inexplicable phenomena. In fact, it is likely that consciousness will soon be considered merely a focusing of attention on mental states and objects of awareness, a portion of the mind's content brought into the mental field of view through this focusing. Attention, closely tied to the object of consciousness, is that mental process we call attention. It is commonly defined as the application of the mind to a mental state, often described as concentrated awareness. However, some have proposed a bold hypothesis, suggesting that consciousness itself may be more the result of attention than simply an incident of it. We won't debate this point here, except to affirm that consciousness greatly depends on the degree of attention paid to its object. Authorities place great importance on the intelligent direction of attention, asserting that without it, higher forms of knowledge are impossible. The common belief is that we feel, see, hear, taste, or smell whenever objects affecting these senses come into contact with the corresponding sensory organs, but this is only partly true. The reality is that we only become aware of sensory reports when attention is directed to the sensation, either voluntarily or involuntarily. In other words, in many cases, although the nerves and sensory organs report a disturbance, the mind does not consciously acknowledge this unless attention is focused on it, either through an act of will or by reflex. For example, a clock may ring loudly, but we may not be aware of it because our attention is focused on a book. Similarly, we may eat the finest meal without tasting it because we are engrossed in a fascinating conversation with our neighbor. It is possible not to notice a surprising event unfolding before our eyes if we are deeply absorbed in thoughts about something else. There are many documented cases showing that one can be so focused on speaking, thinking, or acting that they do not feel pain that would otherwise be unbearable. Writers have forgotten their pains, absorbed in their work. Mothers have not felt pain when their babies urgently needed care. Speakers have been so carried away by their own eloquence that they did not feel the pinpricks their friends used to draw their attention. Not only does perception and feeling depend largely on attention, but so do reasoning, memory, and even willpower. These processes rely heavily on attention to manifest. Psychologists divide attention into two main categories: voluntary attention and involuntary attention. Voluntary attention is that which is directed by the will towards a deliberately chosen object. It requires an effort of will to focus attention in this way, and many people are barely aware of this capacity, so they rarely display it. Voluntary attention is the result of training and practice, marking individuals of strong will, concentration, and character. Some go as far as to say that much of what is commonly called willpower is in reality a developed form of voluntary attention. The strong-willed person keeps the idea they wish to realize firmly in view. Involuntary attention, often called reflexive attention, is the kind triggered by a nervous response to a sensory stimulus. It is the most common form of attention, similar to that displayed by children, whose attention is drawn to every new object, but cannot be sustained on a familiar or uninteresting one for long. It is crucial to cultivate the power of voluntary attention. This not only strengthens the will, but allows for the development of all mental faculties. Training voluntary attention is the first step toward this development. It is a fact that voluntary attention can be trained and developed deliberately, as demonstrated by many of the world's greatest individuals. There is only one way to train and develop any mental power or faculty, through practice and use. Through practice, it is possible to develop an interest in previously uninteresting objects, and thus the use of attention develops the interest that sustains it. Interest is the natural path along which attention moves easily, but interest itself can be induced by concentrated attention. By studying and examining an object, attention reveals many new and unexpected characteristics, sparking a renewed interest that, in turn, draws further attention and prolongs it. There is no royal road to developing voluntary attention. The only real method is work, practice, and use. You must exercise on things that do not interest you, making your desire to develop your voluntary attention power the main interest. But as you begin to pay attention to what does not interest you, you will become interested in the task itself. Take an object and focus your mind on it. Think about its nature, its origin, its utility, its associations, its probable future, related things, etc. Hold your attention firmly on it and exclude all outside thoughts. Then, after some practice, set the object aside for the moment and return to it the next day, trying to discover new points of interest. The primary goal is to hold the object in your mind, which can only be achieved by discovering interesting aspects about it. Attention, hungry for interest, may try to stray to greener pastures on either side, but you must bring your mind back to the task again and again. After a while, the mind will become accustomed to the exercise and may even enjoy it. Vary the practice somewhat by changing objects of examination from time to time. The object does not always need to be visual. Choose a topic from history or literature and explore it, trying to uncover all the facts related to it. Anything can serve as a subject or object of exploration, but whatever you choose must remain firmly and fixedly in the field of conscious attention. Once the habit is established, you will find the exercise fascinating and invent new subjects or objects of inquiry, investigation, and thought, which will reward you in themselves for your work and time. But never lose sight of the main objective: developing the power of voluntary attention. In studying methods to develop and train voluntary attention, the student should remember that any exercise that develops willpower also contributes to developing attention. Similarly, any exercise that strengthens voluntary attention tends to strengthen willpower. Will and attention are so closely linked that what affects one also influences the other. This fact must be considered when designing exercises and practices. When practicing voluntary attention concentration, remember that concentration is not only about focusing attention on a particular object or subject, but also about excluding impressions from other objects or subjects. Some authorities advise students to practice listening to a single instrument, among many in an orchestra, or to focus on reading a book in a room full of conversations. Any exercise that helps reduce the field of attention at any given moment tends to develop its power. The study of mathematics and logic is also considered excellent practice for concentrating voluntary attention, as these disciplines require close attention and concentration. Attention can also be strengthened through any activity that involves analyzing a whole into its parts and then synthesizing or constructing a whole from its scattered parts. Each of the senses must play a role in these exercises, and in addition, the mind must be trained to focus on an abstract idea or mental image, independent of any immediate sensory object. Perception is often misunderstood. Many believe that we perceive everything our senses report to us. In reality, we perceive only a small portion of these sensory reports. Every day, thousands of images are transmitted to our eyes, sounds to our ears, smells to our noses, and touches to our nerves. But not all of these reports are perceived by the mind. We perceive and observe only when voluntary or reflexive attention is directed toward the sensory input, and when the mind interprets this information. Although perception relies on sensory reports for its raw material, it entirely depends on the application of the mind for its completion. Students often have difficulty distinguishing between sensation and perception. A sensation is a simple sensory report that reaches consciousness, while perception is the mental process that follows the sensation. Perception often combines several sensations into a single idea or concept. Through sensation, the mind feels. Through perception, it knows what it feels and identifies the object that caused the sensation. Sensation merely reports an external contact, while perception associates this report with the object that caused it. Perception interprets the reports of sensation. For example, Sensation reports a flash of light above, and perception interprets this light as coming from stars, the moon, the sun, or a meteor. Sensation feels a sharp pain, and perception interprets it as a pinprick. Sensation sees a red spot on a green background, and perception recognizes it as a fence in a bush. While we can perceive a single sensation, our perceptions often group sensations together and associate them with an object or objects. To identify them, perception calls upon memories of past experiences stored in the mind. Memory, imagination, feeling, and reflection all play a role in clear perception. A child initially has weak perceptions, but as they gain experience, they begin to manifest and form more complete perceptions. Sensations are like letters of the alphabet, while perception resembles the formation of words and sentences from those letters. Thus, the letters C, A, and T symbolize sensations, while the word cat, formed from them, symbolizes the perception of the object. It is said that all knowledge begins with sensation, and that the mental history of the human race or individual begins with their first sensation. But while this is accepted, it must be remembered that sensation merely provides the raw, simple, and elementary material of thought. The first real process of thought or knowledge begins with perception. From our perceptions, all our higher concepts and ideas are formed. Perception depends on associating sensation with other previously experienced sensations. It relies on experience. The greater the experience, the higher the possibility of perception, all else being equal. When perception begins, the mind loses sight of the sensation itself, as it identifies it as a quality of the thing that produced it. For example, the sensation of light is perceived as a quality of the star, the sensation of a prick as a quality of the pin or chestnut, and the sensation of smell as a quality of the rose. In the case of the rose, the various sensations of sight, touch, and smell, color, shape, softness, and fragrance are grouped into the perception of the complete object of the flower. A perceiver is the one who perceives, and the object is what is perceived in the act of perception. The concept, of course, is a mental state that corresponds to its external object. It is a combination of several sensations that are considered qualities of the external object, to which are associated memories of past experiences, ideas, feelings, and thoughts. Therefore, although a concept is the simplest form of thought, it is still regarded as a mental state. The formation of a concept occurs in 3 gradual steps, namely, 1. Attention shapes vague nerve reports into conscious and defined sensations. 2. The mind interprets these conscious and defined sensations and attributes them to the external object that causes them. 3. The sensations are grouped together, their unity is perceived, and they are regarded as qualities of the external object. The clear distinction between a sensation and a concept can be remembered by noting the following. A sensation is a feeling, while a concept is a mere thought that identifies one or more sensations. A sensation is simply the conscious recognition of the excitation of a nerve ending, while a concept is the result of a distinct mental process. To develop perception, it is of utmost importance to cultivate and train our power of perception, as our education largely depends on our ability to perceive. It doesn't matter if the external world is filled with countless objects if we do not perceive their existence. Perception is the foundation of the material of our mental world. Many people go through life without even perceiving the most obvious facts. Their eyes and ears function perfectly, their nerves transmit accurate reports, but their perceptive faculties do not observe or interpret these sensory reports. They see and hear clearly, but the information is not observed or recorded. It means nothing to them. One can see many things but observe little. Our knowledge depends less on what we see or hear and more on what we perceive, notice, or observe. Not only does the richness of our practical knowledge largely rest on the development of perception, but success greatly depends on these faculties, whether in business or professional life. The successful person is often the one who has developed their perceptive faculties, who perceives and makes mental notes of what happens in their world, and who can access this knowledge when needed. In our age, where education relies heavily on books, it is observed that young people are not as observant as children who used to rely on their powers of perception to acquire knowledge. A young Arab or Indian will observe more in an hour than a civilized child will in a day. Living in a world of books tends, in many cases, To weaken the powers of observation and perception. Perception can be developed through practice. Start by paying attention to the things you see and hear during your usual walks. Keep the eyes of your mind wide open. Observe people's faces, their walk, their features. Look for interesting or strange things and you will see them. Don't go through life daydreaming, but keep a keen eye on what is of interest and value. The most familiar things will reward you for the time and effort you invest in examining them in detail. The practice gained from such tasks will be valuable in developing perception. An author notes that very few people, even those who live in the countryside, know whether a cow's ears are positioned above, below, in front of or behind its horns, or whether cats climb down trees head first or tail first. Very few can distinguish the leaves of different types of trees in their neighborhood. Few people can describe the house they live in beyond general features. The details are unknown to them. Robert Houdin, the French illusionist, could walk past a store window, perceive every item it contained, and describe them afterward. But he developed this skill only through constant and gradual practice. He himself said that this ability was nothing compared to that of a fashionable woman who could pass another woman on the street and, in one glance, perceive her entire outfit from head to toe. She could describe not only the style and quality of the fabrics, but also tell if the lace was real or machine-made. It is said that a former president of Yale could glance at a book and read a quarter of a page in one go. Any study or occupation requiring analysis develops the power of perception. Consequently, by analyzing the things we see, breaking them down into their constituent elements, we also develop our perceptive faculties. It is a good exercise to examine a small object and strive to discover as many distinct points of perception as possible, noting them down on paper. Even the most familiar object, when carefully examined, will yield rich results in discoveries. If two people participate in such a contest, the spirit of rivalry and competition will stimulate their powers of observation. Those who have had the patience and persistence to practice these kinds of exercises systematically report seeing steady improvement from the start. But even if one is not inclined to practice in this way, one will notice the possibility of beginning to observe the details of the things one sees, people's facial expressions, the details of their clothing, their tone of voice, the quality of the goods one handles, and especially the little things. Perception, like attention, follows interest. However, one can also create interest in things by observing their details and peculiarities. The best knowledge one obtains is that which comes from personal perception. There is a closeness and truth in what is known in this way, compared to what is merely believed because it has been read or heard. This knowledge becomes a part of oneself. A person's knowledge depends not only on what they perceive, but also on the very nature of their perceptions. One's character also results from the character of their perceptions. The influence of the environment is great, and what is the environment if not what one perceives of it? It is not so much what is outside of oneself, but rather what enters through perception. By directing one's attention to desirable objects and perceiving as many details as possible, one truly shapes their own character at will. The world needs good observers. In all fields of life, there is a shortage of such people, and the demand is high. People are willing to pay a good price for their services. A person who can voluntarily perceive and observe details in a profession, trade, or business will go far in that vocation. The education of children must actively take the faculty of perception into account. Kindergartens have made some strides in this direction, but much remains to be done. Memory. Psychologists classify memory and imagination as representative mental processes, respectively. The term representation is used in psychology to indicate the processes of recalling or bringing back to consciousness what had been previously presented but had faded from awareness. As Hamilton says, the general capacity for knowledge necessarily requires that, in addition to the power to evoke a part of our retained knowledge from unconsciousness, we also possess the faculty to represent in consciousness what is thus evoked. Memory is the mind's primary representative faculty. Imagination depends on memory for its materialization, as we will see later. Any mental process involving a memory, recollection, or the representation of a sensation, perception, mental image, thought, or idea previously experienced must depend on memory for its realization. Memory is the mind's great reservoir, where the records of past mental experiences are stored. It is a part of the vast subconscious field of mental activity, and most of its work is done below the level of consciousness. It is only when its results pass into the field of consciousness that we become aware of its existence. We know memory only by its works, but we know little of its nature, though some of its main laws and principles have been discovered. In the past, it was common to classify memory among the various faculties of the mind, but modern psychology no longer considers it this way. Memory is now viewed as a general power of the mind that manifests itself in connection with all other mental faculties. It is now regarded as belonging to the vast subconscious field of mentality, and its explanation must be sought there. Otherwise, it is entirely inexplicable. The importance of memory cannot be overestimated. Not only does a person's character and education primarily depend on memory, but their very mental being is also tied to it. Without memory, a person would never mentally progress beyond the state of a newborn. They would never be able to benefit from experience, form clear perceptions, reason, or make judgments. The processes of thought depend on memory of past experiences to provide material. Without this material, there can be no thought. Memory has two important functions. 1, the retention of impressions and experiences, and 2, the reproduction of the impressions and experiences thus retained. It was once thought that memory retained only part of the impressions and experiences it recorded, but the current theory is that it retains all the impressions and experiences it has noted. It is true that many of these impressions are never reproduced in consciousness, but experiences tend to show that these records are always present in memory, and that proper and sufficiently strong stimuli will bring them back into the field of consciousness. The phenomena of sleepwalking, dreams, hysteria, delirium, near-death experiences, etc., show that the subconscious mind contains an immense accumulation of seemingly forgotten facts which can be recalled through unusual stimuli. The power of memory to reproduce retained impressions and experiences is referred to in various ways: recall, reminiscence, or memory. This faculty varies considerably from one individual to another, but it is an axiom of psychology that each person's memory can be developed and trained through practice. The ability to remember largely depends on the clarity and depth of the initial impression, which in turn depends on the degree of attention given to it at the moment it occurs. Recall is also facilitated by the law of association, or the principle that one mental fact is linked to another. The more a fact is connected to other facts, the easier it will be to remember. Recall is also favored by use and exercise. Just like fingers, the memory cells in the brain become adept and efficient through exercise and use, or become stiff and ineffective due to a lack of exercise. In addition to the phases of retention and reproduction, there are two other important phases of memory, namely, 3, the recognition of the reproduced impression or experience, and 4, the localization of the impression or its reference to a more or less defined time and place. The recognition of the recalled impression is very important. It is not enough for the impression to be retained and recalled if we are unable to recognize it as something we have already experienced. If we do not recognize the recalled impression, it will be of little use in our thought processes. The goals of thought require that we can identify the recalled impression with the original one. Recognition is, in fact, a form of acknowledgement. It is similar to perception. The mind becomes aware of the recalled impression in the same way it becomes aware of a sensation, and then recognizes the relationship of the recalled impression to the original, just as it recognizes the relationship of the sensation to its object. The localization of the recalled and recognized impression is also important. Even if we recognize the recalled impression, it will be of little utility unless we can locate it as having occurred yesterday, last week, last month, last year, 10 years ago, or at another time in the past, and as having taken place in our office, our home, or in a specific place on the street or in a distant location. Without the power of localization, we could not connect and associate the recalled fact with the time, place, and people to which it is related, making it less useful and valuable in our thought processes. Retention. The retention of a mental impression in memory largely depends on the clarity and depth of the initial impression, and this clarity and depth, as mentioned, depend on the degree of attention given to the initial impression. Attention is therefore the key factor in forming and recording impressions. The rule is simple. Light attention yields a weak recording, while marked attention produces a clear and deep recording. To grasp this fact well, the student can compare the phases of retention and reproduction of memory to a phonographic recording. The diaphragm of the phonograph represents the sensory organs, and the engraving needle represents attention. The needle records deeply or weakly on the cylinder based on its adjustment. A loud sound may be recorded weakly if the needle is not properly adjusted. It is also important to remember that the quality of reproduction depends almost entirely on the clarity and depth of the original impression on the cylinder. As the record is, so will the reproduction be. The student would do well to keep this image of the phonograph in mind, as it will help them develop their memory capacity. We must also remember that attention largely depends on interest. It is therefore natural to expect that we will retain things we are interested in much more easily than those that do not interest us. This hypothesis is confirmed by actual experience. This explains why individuals retain certain categories of information better than others. One person remembers faces better, another remembers dates, yet another recalls conversations heard or written words, and so on. In general, each person is interested in the types of things they remember more easily. An artist easily remembers faces and facial details, or landscapes and their details. A musician easily remembers passages or measures of music, often very complex. A speculator readily retains quotes of his favorite stocks. A gambler has no difficulty remembering the odds of a horse on a given date or details of a race that took place many years ago. The moral is this: awaken and stimulate interest in the things you want to memorize. This interest can be awakened by studying these things, as we suggested in a previous chapter. Visualization in memory. Many authorities argue that initial impressions can be made clearer and deeper, and that the process of reproduction becomes more effective through the practice of visualizing what one wants to memorize. By visualization, we mean forming a mental image of the object in the imagination. If you wish to remember the appearance of an object, examine it closely, then step away from it and try to reproduce its appearance as a mental image in your mind. If you do this, you will create a particularly vivid impression in your memory, and when you remember the object, you will find that the mental image of it will also be present and clear. Of course, the more details observed and included in the initial mental image, the richer the memory will be in detail. Perception and memory. In memory, attention is necessary to form clear recordings, but attentive perception is also important. Without clear perception, details will be missing in the retained recording, and the element of association will be absent. It is not enough to recall a thing in itself. One must also remember everything related to it. Practicing methods for developing perception, as presented in a previous chapter, will tend to develop and train the powers of retention, reproduction, recognition, and localization of memory. The rule is as follows. The greater the degree of perception given to a thing, the richer the detail of the retained impression will be, and the easier it will be to remember it. Understanding and memory. Another important point in acquiring impressions in memory is as follows. The better the understanding of the subject or object, the clearer the impressions will be, and the more accurate the memory will be. This fact is demonstrated by experience. A subject that is difficult to remember under ordinary circumstances will be easily memorized if it is explained thoroughly and accompanied by some familiar illustrations or examples. It is very difficult to memorize a string of meaningless words, whereas a sentence that expresses a clear meaning can be easily memorized. If we understand the usefulness or functioning of something, we retain it much more easily than if we have no understanding of it. Pringle Morgan, who conducted a series of experiments in this area, found that he could memorize a stanza of poetry in about 1/10 of the usual time required. Gordy recounts that he once asked a brilliant student from Johns Hopkins University to report on a lecture he had just attended. "I can't," the student replied. "It wasn't logical. The rule is the more we understand something, the more easily we remember it." This is a point worth highlighting. Memory. The question of memory cannot be intelligently approached without considering the law of association, one of the most important psychological principles. What psychology refers to as the law of association is based on the fact that no idea exists in the mind without being associated with other ideas. This is not generally recognized, and most people would dispute this law at first glance. However, the existence and emergence of ideas in the mind are governed by a mental law as unchanging and constant as the physical law of gravitation. Each idea is associated with other ideas. Ideas travel in groups. One group is linked to another, and so on, until ultimately every idea in the mind is associated, directly or indirectly, with any other idea. Theoretically, it would be possible to start with one idea in a person's mind and gradually unravel their entire stock of ideas, like unwinding a thread from a spool. Our thoughts unfold according to this law. We sit in a chair and move from one topic to another until we are unable to remember the connection between the first and last thought. Yet each step in this daydreaming is connected to the one that precedes it and the one that follows. It is interesting to trace these connections. Poe based one of his famous detective stories on this law. Daydreaming can be interrupted by a sudden impression from the outside, and we then proceed from that impression, linking it to something already in our experience and thus triggering a new chain of sequences. We often fail to trace the associations that govern our ideas, but the chain is always there. One might think of a scene or a past experience without any apparent cause, but upon reflection, it becomes clear that something seen, notes of a song heard, or the scent of a flower provided the link between the past and the present. An olfactory suggestion might recall a past event where the scent played a role, perhaps because someone's handkerchief carried the same fragrance. Or a familiar old melody may remind us of a person, place, or event from the past. A familiar feature on the face of a passerby may remind us of someone else who had the same shape of mouth, nose, or expression, leading us down a sequence of recalled experiences. Often the initial idea or connection links only faintly to consciousness, but rest assured, they are always there. In fact, we often accept this law unconsciously without realizing its actual existence. For example, someone makes a remark, and immediately we wonder how that idea came to their mind. If we pay attention, we may deduce what was in their mind before they spoke. There are two general types of association of ideas in memory. 1. Continuity association, and 2. Logical association. Continuity association depends on the prior association in time or space of ideas that have been imprinted in the mind. For instance, if you meet Mr. and Mrs. Weatherhoon and they are introduced one after the other, you will naturally remember Mr. W. when thinking of Mrs. W. and vice versa. Similarly, you will recall Napoleon when thinking of Wellington, or Benedict Arnold when thinking of Major Andre. In the same way, you might think of abstract time when thinking of abstract space, thunder when thinking of lightning, a stomachache when thinking of green apples, or love and moonlit nights when thinking of your college years. Likewise, we remember events that occurred just before or just after the one we are currently thinking of, or things close in space to what we are thinking about. Logical association, on the other hand, is based on the relationship of similarity or difference between different thoughts. The elements thus associated may not have been present in the mind at the same time in the past, and are not necessarily connected by time or space. For example, one might think of a book, and then, by association, think of another book by the same author, or another author addressing the same subject. Alternatively, one might think of a book diametrically opposed to the first, with the relationship being one of difference rather than similarity. Logical association depends on internal relationships rather than external relationships of time and space. This invisible relationship between disconnected things in time or space is discovered only through experience and education. The educated person perceives many points of relation between things that the uneducated person considers completely unrelated. Wisdom and knowledge consist largely of recognizing relationships between things. Association in memory. From the consideration of the law of association, it follows that when one wishes to imprint something in memory, one must, as an expert says, multiply associations. Wrap the fact you want to retain in a web of associations as vast as possible, particularly logical associations, hence the advice to group and classify facts in memory. As Blackie puts it, nothing aids the mind as much as order and classification. Classes are always few while individuals are many. To know a class well is to know what is essential in the character of the individual and what burdens the memory least to retain. Repetition in memory. Another important principle of memory is that impressions gain depth and clarity through repetition. If a verse is repeated once, it may be remembered. If it is repeated again, the chances of remembering it increase significantly. If it is repeated a sufficient number of times, one cannot escape remembering it. The illustration of the phonograph will help you understand the reason for this. The rule is that constant repetition deepens impressions. Reviewing and frequently recalling what has been memorized tends to keep the recordings clear and sharp, in addition to deepening the impression with each revision. General rules of memory. The following general rules will be useful for the student wishing to develop their memory. Create the impression, pay attention, cultivate interest, manifest perception, cultivate understanding, or form associations, or repeat and review. Tips for remembering impressions. Try to catch the loose end of the association, then unwind your memory spool. When recalling an impression, energize it to deepen it and link it to as many new associations as possible. Practice a little memorization and recall each day, even if it's just a verse. Memory improves with practice and deteriorates with neglect and disuse. Demand good service from your memory, and it will learn to respond. Learn to trust it, and it will rise to the occasion. How can you expect your memory to serve you well if you constantly abuse it and tell everyone, "What a bad memory I have, I can never remember anything"? Your memory is very likely to accept your statements as truth. Our mental faculties have this unfortunate habit of taking our words literally in these matters. Tell your memory what you expect from it, then trust it and refrain from abusing it or giving it a bad reputation. Final advice. Finally, keep this rule in mind. Only what you put into your memory will come out of it. Put in good, clear, and deep impressions, and it will reproduce only good, clear, and strong memories. Think of your memory as a phonograph, and ensure that you put the appropriate impressions into it. In memory, you reap what you sow. You must give to memory before you can receive from it. One thing is certain. Unless you take sufficient interest in the things you want to remember, you will find that memory will not care enough to memorize them. Memory demands interest before it will engage with the task, requires attention before it will grant it, needs understanding before it gives understanding, seeks association before it responds to association, and calls for repetition before it will repeat. Memory is a splendid instrument, but it maintains its dignity and asserts its rights. It belongs to the ancient dispensation, demands compensation, and believes in giving only to the same extent that it receives. Our advice is to become familiar with your memory and befriend it. Treat it well, and it will serve you, but if you neglect it, it will turn its back on you.